At London Financial Studies, we focus exclusively on capital markets. Our programs offer practical learning to professionals from all over the world.
The topic we're going to discuss today is specifically wrong-way risk and methods of quantifying it within the world of counterparty risk. So this is roughly what I'm going to go through. Start with a few definitions and motivations and thinking about classic wrong-way risk type situations. We'll look at a relatively recent example where we could argue that wrong-way risk played a role, which is the default of Archegos. We'll look at different wrong-way risk modeling approaches, and if there is time, I'd like to also look at the impact of wrong-way risk in the presence of initial margin, specifically in the presence of dynamic initial margin. So by way of introduction, wrong-way risk is a fairly big challenge for financial institutions and quite a difficult data and modeling problem. It's well known that the failure to properly quantify and manage wrong-way risk is generally linked to billions of dollars of losses over a number of years. So we could think back to the financial crisis in 2008 and monoline insurers as one example, or we could think about the more recent Archegos default as another example, which we'll look at in a minute. And also regulatory scrutiny is increasing, although maybe not that quickly. And the reason I say that is because I think obviously this topic has been around for at least 20 years, and I'm not sure the progress that has been made is maybe as satisfactory as we might like. I'd like to start with the definition of CVA and the way in which you derive the CVA formula, which I'm not going through here, but is shown in an appendix, and you're welcome to get in touch if you need more information on that. CVA is obviously sort of primarily one of the metrics used to quantify counterparty risk. And the sort of general representation of CVA looks something like this, where you write the value with counterparty risk as being the value without counterparty risk. I call that no default, ND, plus or minus, depending on the way you define it, the CVA, and CVA normally being a negative quantity. Now, there are a number of implications of this formula. The first one is that the non-default value of the derivative which sits within the CVA formula should be exactly the same calculation as the non-default within what's here, the base value. Now, unless the value is just a simple case of discounting like a swap or a forward, that is something that's very, very hard to achieve and is a big problem, but is not really the subject of today. I'm talking here about the fact that CVA models cannot align perfectly with the models that are used just generally for each of the underlying transactions. That's something we cover in a lot more detail in my XVA course with London Financial Studies, but I'm not going to cover it today, as I mentioned. Secondly, the measure for calculating CVA must be the same measure as the base valuation, which is really the same comment, and really that means CVA should be a risk-neutral calculation. Again, something we're not going to really look at today. With regard to wrong-way risk, the important thing is that the conditionality within that CVA formula, which is what's there, a sort of indicator function, that the default time, which is tau, has to be less than the final maturity of the portfolio, must be respected. And the reason that must be respected is in order to get the CVA formula, you have to split out the non-default value into a bit which is conditional on default and a bit which is not conditional on default. And obviously when you put those together, you just get the unconditional bit. But you split them out and one bit ends up in the CVA formula and one bit doesn't. So that conditionality must be respected. And this is what we generally just call wrong-way risk, the fact that that conditionality has to be somehow quantified or taken into account.